You're welcome again, folks, to Psalm 23 as we're getting into the Word. And we are focusing today on verse 4. Let me read it with you. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Now, already in the psalm, you will remember, we have said that the Lord is our shepherd because he attracts our faith. Then he provides our food, and then, as we saw, he guides our feet. Now today we come to this wonderful verse, the longest verse in the psalm, where the psalmist talks about God, the shepherd, dispelling our fears. Dispelling our fears. I suppose part and parcel of being human is that we do have fears and phobias. This can be expressed in different ways. Fear can be a positive thing, it can be a negative thing, and also it can be an active thing. I mean, with regard to its positivity, we teach our children in particular when they're small to be careful of fire and water and electricity and alcohol and drugs, to name but a few. And we do that from a positive perspective, that they might have a genuine fear as to what these various things can do to them. It also can be a very negative thing for us to live in fear. We fear about our health, our finances, our family, and our future. And all of these fears are part and parcel of you and I being human. So it can be positive, and it can be extremely negative and affect us in so many ways. But the fear that the psalmist is talking about is an active fear, a fear of the Lord. And he's seemingly saying to us that when we fear God, then we have nothing else to fear. Now, of course, whenever we think of fear with regard to the Lord himself, we're not thinking of a cringing, cowering experience in some corner, realizing that there's a God up there that frightens us. No, that's not the biblical understanding of fear from an active point of view. It very simply means a genuine reverence and respect for God. In Proverbs 14, verse 27, we read there that the fear of the Lord is the fountain of life. And then in the New Testament, in Acts chapter 9, verse 31, we read that the early church there lived in the fear of God, the fear of the Lord. And I love the old expression that's used in some of our older translations. They walked in the fear of God. And so there is a fear that can be very active, so that when we are consciously aware of our mighty God, now we can face the fears of life, whatever they be. And so this verse talks about, within our own particular hearts, about God dispelling our fears. Now, the psalm itself is fascinating from all kinds of directions, isn't it? In verses 1 to 3, for example, the psalmist is talking about the shepherd. The Lord is my shepherd. Now in verses 4 to 6, he's talking to the shepherd. And so as he's singing the words, as he is strumming a tune, as he is meditating in his mind as to what's going on, he's talking to the shepherd. And his heart is encouraged and refreshed by what he is thinking about. Now, in this verse alone, we read of four things, and we shall be looking at them one by one. For example, the verse begins with the path, about walking a particular path, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow. And then he talks about the problem. And the problem, of course, that David faced as a shepherd, and also he knew that regarding the sheep, that there was a real problem and many problems ahead. The problem that David is talking about is the problem of evil. And so there's a path that we need to follow, but there's a problem that we need to face, and that problem is the problem of evil. Then you'll notice, thirdly, that there's a peace that we can experience in all this. You are with me. And then finally, there is tremendous protection. Your rod and staff, they comfort me. So those are the four things that we're going to have a look at: the path, the problem, the peace, and the protection. The earlier part of the verse talks about the path that we need to follow. We're going to have a look at this verse in reverse. The verse itself says, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. Let's look at that in reverse, shall we? From the point of view of death and shadow and valley and walk. Let's concentrate in these moments on this whole question of death. These four words that are very descriptive of bringing to us so much fear. So then there is fear regarding death. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15:26 that the last enemy to be destroyed is death. We realize immediately, don't we, as we begin to understand our world, that 10 out of 10 people die. Death is a reality. The Bible, when speaking about death, speaks of it in three ways. Number one, it speaks of physical death, that which the psalmist is specifically thinking about in this verse. Then it speaks to us about spiritual death. The Apostle Paul in Ephesians 2 says that by nature we are born with a problem, and that problem is the problem of sin. We are dead in trespasses and sins. So there is a physical death, but there's a spiritual death. And by nature, we can never find real life until we find the Saviour. And then, of course, the psalmist talks about an eternal death, something that separates us from God eternally, and all that that means. So death is a reality, and physical death in particular, that which we're thinking about today, is something that captures our minds, particularly if something happens to us as a family and there's a cataclysmic event that turns our family upside down. Or maybe we're getting older and we realize our own mortality there. Napoleon Bonaparte, that well-known French leader, said many years ago, I die before my time, and my body shall go back to the earth for worms. How different to Job in the Old Testament. Job was a godly man. He went through so much. The patience of Job and the sufferings of Job are extremely well known. But what does Job say in relation to death? He says this, I know that my Redeemer lives, and after my skin has been destroyed, yet in my flesh I shall see God. And so there's all the difference in the world between even a great leader who has so much going for him, and yet has no hope regarding that which is beyond the now, and someone who knows the living Lord, and he knows that one day he will see as God. So let's pursue this further, this whole business about death. Of course, within our 21st century world, people joke about it. For many years, of course, have joked about it. Spike Milligan, I understand, on his tombstone has these words, I told you I was sick. I told you I wasn't well. Woody Allen, the famous actor, director, and quite an unusual character to say the least, said this a number of years ago. My relationship with death remains the same. I'm strongly against it, and all I can do is wait for it. My, what words are those? All I can do in life, the life that I'm living now, all I can do is to just wait for death to happen. So in reality, death is a powerful enemy. And although sometimes folk might joke about it, it is something that we think about maybe more times than we care to admit. Paul Assinger is a very famous American golfer. I think he's retired from the golf now, but still very much involved. A number of years ago, he was born in 1960. A number of years ago, he discovered one day that he'd got cancer. This obviously was something that overwhelmed his mind and heart, as it does. It certainly focuses the mind. And so he went to see the chaplain of the team. The chaplain said this to him, I'll never forget his words. He said to him, Paul, we think we're in the land of the living, going to the land of the dying. But we're in the land of the dying, going to the land of the living. And the chaplain was right on. Death is a reality. But is this, folks, all that there is to life? We are born, we live, we marry, we have families, we spend time at work, etc., then we die. Is that it? No. There is life now by trusting in Jesus personally. And of course, when we die, there is life beyond. So there is the word death. You notice the second word here in this part of the verse, the word shadow. There's a difference between shadow and substance. Remember how when we were children again, perhaps we had a light behind us and we used our fingers to show various animals on the wall. Maybe a rabbit or a dog or a cat, depending how skilled we are. But of course, the shadow on the wall wasn't a real dog or cat or rabbit. It was but a shadow. There's all the difference in the world, isn't there, between shadow and substance. In the last century, there lived a Presbyterian preacher, a minister in America called Donald G. Barnhouse. Donald Barnhouse must have been a remarkable man. He would go along, for example, to a Baptist church, and he would give a number of biblical reasons as to why we should baptize infants. He would also go to his own church, the Presbyterian church, where he would give a biblical rationale for adult baptism, what we would call believer's baptism. And so he was a fascinating character, and he said and did so much. On one occasion in his own life, he lost his wife through death. That must be the most horrendous thing for any husband or any wife or any child to go through, to lose their nearest and dearest. This dear man, Donald Barnhouse, had a number of children, and on the way to the cemetery, they were driving in the car. His wife, Ruth, was to be buried. His boys and girls were overcome with grief, as one can understand. If we've not been there, we just understand in small measure. But the car is brought to a halt because it is stopped by a giant digger, a JCB machine. And so as the doctor is sitting there with his children, the shadow of the digger comes across the front of the car. They're there for a few moments, but Barnhouse, being the skilled illustrator that he was, turned to his children and said this. He said, children, would you rather be hit by a digger, a JCB, or by a shadow of the JCB? And of course, the children immediately knew what their father was talking about. Now, God has promised to all who will trust in him, the living Lord, that when death comes, and it will be powerful, and it will be overcoming, when death comes for those who really believe, it is but a shadow, and God promises to take them through. So the second word then that we're thinking about is shadow. We don't know how we will die. We don't have that choice. If I had the choice, I would love to die preaching at the pulpit and there all of a sudden have some cardiac arrest, bang, that would be it. But I don't have that choice. And many of my dearest friends, not least this past year, have died quite suddenly and in difficult circumstances. So we don't know how we will die. And we just pray that God will give us the grace in those moments to know that He's there. But for the Christian, death is a shadow. Notice the third word in the psalm. It is the word valley. Of course, when one thinks of valley in Old Testament terms, especially in relation to David, one thinks of that story in 1 Samuel 17, where in the valley of Elah, David is facing Goliath. It was in 1967, of course, that during the Six-Day War that much of the theatre of war was in the valley of Elah, I understand. Now here David describes the shadow of death as a valley, That valley is dark. We're not too sure, perhaps, as to where we are. That valley is difficult because we've never come this way before. And of course, that valley is deadly. But yet David says that even in the valley of the shadow of death, we will fear no evil. That's because his faith, as I say, is in the living Lord. Now, there are many valleys that you and I go through in life, aren't there? Valley of darkness and difficulty and distress. And yet, we know, maybe not instantly at that given moment of time, but in looking back, we know that God has been with us and He has strengthened us in the time of storm. But let's note the last word. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. Woody Allen again says this: I am not afraid of death. I just don't want to be there when it happens. I find that funny, but of course He'll be there all right, and so will you and I. Now, whenever we think of death, we observe very, very quickly that there are all of us who walk to it. Each individual on the planet is walking one day to a place called death. If we allow that to overtake our minds, we'd get totally depressed. But we've got to think of it for a moment that we're all going there. From the moment we are born, we begin to die. There are some who try to run from it. If only I can escape it. If only I can get away, then I'll make it. But of course, no matter how fast you run, no matter how hard you try, it's impossible to run from it. And then, of course, there are other folk, good people, who live in it on a day-to-day basis. Good souls who are facing the reality of what it means to die. I'm thinking about those brave souls who have some terminal disease, or those dear folk who have dementia. We know that they live in their own world, and it's something that's very, very powerful and very, very sad. It's a cruel disease. And their families around them also are right there in the middle of it all. And so there are good folk who every day have got to go through some deathly experience. That must be so difficult. Oh, I can hardly imagine it. Getting up in the morning thinking, what does this day hold for me? There's not much hope. And so death being the reality that it is, we all walk to it. Some try to run from it. Others live in it. But what does the psalmist say? Yea, though I walk, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. Those who know God, no matter what lies ahead, can walk through that valley. One of my favorite stories, of course, is The Pilgrim's Progress. The pilgrim on his journey to the celestial city. And I read the book and its sequel quite often. But what a wonderful section it is when Pilgrim walks through the gates of death and he comes to the celestial city. Death is the darkest valley, but David can face it. The sheep are constantly in dark places, but because the shepherd is there, they will reach their destination and will get to where the shepherd wants them to be. And so, folks, today, as we think about the reality of death, let's not be downhearted and distressed. It's a reality, all right, as we've said. But God encourages us to know that our fears can be dispelled because he's there with us as the shepherd of the sheep and will get us to our destination. Next time, we'll look at the rest of the verse, which is full of so much. Bye for now. God bless and keep going.